Now, he went on to question whether the government trampled on South Africans' fundamental rights when deciding on the lockdowns and the vaccines. Reporting on the matters, legal journalist Karyn Maughn, who notes that it was apparent that he was distrustful of both governments' response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its vaccine program. And she joins us now to unpack this a little bit further. Karyn, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. Let me put that question that he put himself. Has COVID-19 had an impact on good governance as well as ethical leadership?
Well, I think there's obviously question marks that need to be raised about certainly the PPE scandal, which is still under investigation by law enforcement. That SIU report in relation to digital vibes, which essentially forced the then Health Minister Zweli Mkhize to resign. There are serious question marks, for example, around procurement practices, as there have been for a number of years. But, there are also bigger issues, I think, in relation to his comments about the vaccination that are, I think, arguably problematic. And I think also, while he raises very legitimate concerns, for example, about government's use of the Disaster Management Act to, essentially give these largely untrammeled powers to the National Coronavirus Command Council to enforce lockdown and regulations. This was itself the subject of a court case that the DA, if I recall correctly, actually attempted to launch in the Constitutional Court, and we're told to go, I think we're forced essentially to go to the High Court. So it's interesting now at this point that a very profound legal dispute, which I think continues to occupy our courts, is now something that he is choosing to comment on as the outgoing Chief Justice. And I think, there will obviously be questions raised about why he is doing that now at this time. It's a clear political, social, economic question that needs to be raised. But as a former head of the judiciary, is he indicating in raising it that he has sort of political dimensions or ambitions beyond his office right now?
And those are some interesting questions, and we'll get to the Chief Justice and what perhaps could be behind him mentioning or speaking out. But let's talk about some of his utterances. You mentioned that the fact that he's made some really good points, amongst others, but in totality, does he have legal ground? He says that South Africans need to essentially challenge the constitutionality of the current lockdown or the state of disaster, saying that it should actually be a state of emergency.
Well, he said that essentially, this has been a legal debate that has been going on for quite some time, because the issue is there adequate parliamentary oversight over the way in which lockdown regulations are, imposed? Is by utilizing the Disaster Management Act, rather, he argues that utilizing that instead of the Constitution, is there an argument to be made, as the DA has actually made in court papers, that we are essentially, not allowing Parliament to debate these issues, to allow duly elected public officials to really fight the corner of the ordinary South African in terms of how lockdowns are enforced? And I think there are obviously valid questions in terms of that. As I said before, there was litigation launched by the DA. The last update I saw about it was in April, so I'm actually personally not sure as to how far that litigation actually got. But one of the things that they raised is that, in allowing the Command Council, in allowing the President, in allowing the Minister of Cocta to essentially have these rights to just impose regulations on South Africans without due debate within Parliament, that was denying South Africans, their fundamental rights. And I think there is an argument to be made about that, and one has to hope that there is certainty created, because I think that certainly on that point there is a lot of unhappiness, certainly in terms of the repercussions that some of the regulations have had. We have seen litigation in relation to the alcohol ban. We have seen litigation in relation to the cigarette ban. We have seen litigation in relation to certain of, I think it was the level 4 regulations. Ultimately, in each instance, government ultimately succeeding in that. But certainly a feeling from a number of people or quarters in society that have taken these cases to court, that they were irrational and that they did do fundamental damage to a number of businesses and to ordinary people.
I mean, a year and 8 months later, the state of disaster is still in place in South Africa and across many parts of the world. So that's not really the issue here. But should we maybe now be looking at getting Parliament involved in some of these decisions that need to be made, that are so key, that are now left still to the Coronavirus Command Council, as well as the President and Dr. Dlamini Zuma?
I think yes, indeed, because I think, South Africans are frustrated. I think, we certainly see it in relation to some of the responses. I think if people felt that there was more debate, that they had more opportunity through their duly elected representatives to vocalize their unhappiness, there may be greater buy-in if indeed we do have a scenario where we face more, higher coronavirus COVID-19 figures, and there is then a debate, obviously, around the necessity of lockdowns. But given the economic situation in which we find ourselves, I think that certainly the messaging that we've got from government in light of the vaccination program is that is something that they're going to attempt to avoid. However, we still sit with curfews. Those issues are, a subject of debate. Issues around the use of, for instance, an alcohol ban in circumstances where, there's an attempt to address high levels of emergency patients in hospitals that are overwhelmed by COVID patients will clearly be a debate that continues to happen. But I think that when there is an ambit or an ability for people to feel that these are not simply decisions that are imposed on them, that will obviously be something that is potentially positive in terms of public buy-in on the kind of, enforcement that may happen in the future. Hopefully, we hope that the vaccination program prevents that. But if indeed it is the case, that the ordinary people feel that, yes, there is a debate, their issues, their concerns are being taken into account.
Absolutely. I mean, South Africans for the longest time have had to essentially just watch and fall in line to whatever the requirements are set out by the President. Let's talk about the retired Chief Justice now. He's been slammed, obviously, for his remarks, as would be expected. What do you make of them, first of all? And secondly, why now do you think he's speaking out?
Well, I mean, I think, he raised, as we said before, very valid concerns around, the use of the Disaster Management Act and obviously the issues around oversight, public debates, not, having a necessary parliamentary mechanism for oversight. But his comments around COVID vaccination, which come, I think, after in 2020, his utterances in Tembisa, where he essentially prayed against, vaccination that was marked with 666 and I think could mutate people's DNA. He asked that God, that the Lord Jesus consume this in a fire. And obviously a number of people took that as raising concerns about the validity of COVID vaccination. The Judicial Services Judicial Conduct Committee still investigating that matter at this stage. But now, in his recent utterances, which he has posed as a series of questions, he has again, raised issues about people's rights to not be experimented upon, and essentially suggested that COVID vaccination was experimental. That is simply not the case. We know that the vaccinations have gone through trials. We know that, for instance, they have been vetted by the World Health Organization. They are not experimental. That people are now in a position, to adequately protect themselves against the worst kind of impacts of COVID through these vaccinations. And it's very problematic that in posing these questions, I think the former Chief Justice has indicated that he's simply not done the work to actually find out what the true state of play is. Some of his comments about, anecdotal comments about a friend whose relative collapsed after receiving the vaccination, because they had high blood pressure, for instance, are not scientifically sustainable. We know that people with hypertension, for example, are exactly the kind of people that should be vaccinated. So there were a lot of comments there that really appear to be designed to create fear and to only contribute to what is already very high, levels of vaccine hesitancy amongst ordinary people. And certainly, I think, the kind of criticism that the former Chief Justice has come into line for is that he is perpetuating narratives that support the anti-vax lobby's position that vaccines are simply unsafe when they are statistically shown, 2 to 3 deaths out of 1 million, that arguably could be linked to vaccination versus 4,100 per million linked to COVID where people are not vaccinated. So I think that they're incredibly irresponsible, and I certainly hope that the Judicial Service Commission does reach some kind of level of finality about whether judges are in a position to make these kind of comments.
Karyn Maughn, thank you so much for your time. She's a legal journalist, just unpacking those comments that the retired Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng made on Thursday. Up next.